He was a boy wonder with gloves, a champion at just 17, the youngest world title holder in the history of boxing. Wilfred Benítez fought with an instinct so sharp people called him the radar. But today, that radar is silent. The same man who dazzled millions with reflexes that defied logic can no longer feed himself. He no longer recognizes his loved ones. The cheers have stopped. Paychecks are long gone. And in a small room far from the spotlight, he now lives in silence, unable to speak, walk, or remember the glory he once embodied. What happened to the prodigy from Puerto Rico? And why did the sport he gave his life to leave him behind? This is the story of how greatness was abandoned, and how a sister became the last person standing between a legend and total oblivion. Before his name became synonymous with tragedy, Wilfred Benítez was considered a boxing miracle. Born in 1958 to a deeply rooted Puerto Rican boxing family in the Bronx, Wilfred wasn't just destined to fight, he was engineered for it. His father, Gregorio, managed his training from the time he could lace gloves, and his older brothers had already stepped into the ring. But Wilfred was different. He didn't just hit fast, he thought faster. They called him El Radar because it felt like he had a built-in detection system for punches. The moment someone twitched, Wilfred was already slipping it. By the time most kids his age were figuring out high school lockers, Wilfred was racking up professional victories against seasoned adults. At just 15 years old, he was already fighting in legitimate professional bouts, stepping into rings with men twice his age, absorbing blows, and giving them right back with ring IQ far beyond his years. But he wasn't a bruiser. His genius came in the form of precision and movement. He could make dangerous punchers look foolish with nothing but head movement and counterpunches. Then came March 6, 1976. Just 17 years old and barely old enough to drive, Wilfred stood across from Antonio Cervantes, a hardened two-time world champion who had no intention of losing to a teenager. Most saw it as a publicity stunt, a sideshow mismatch. But after 15 rounds of pure grit, defense, and masterful timing, Wilfred walked away with a split decision win. He was now the youngest world champion in boxing history. It wasn't a lucky punch or an off night from Cervantes. It was a blueprint of future greatness, executed perfectly by a teenager. The boxing world was shocked. Fans from Puerto Rico to Madison Square Garden stood in awe. This wasn't just a win, it was a coronation. What followed was a meteoric rise. Promoters came knocking, networks wanted a piece, and fans hailed him as the next big thing in boxing. Wilfred wasn't just fighting anymore, he was building a legacy. But as the accolades piled up, so did the expectations. And with every belt he added to his name, the pressure to perform at impossible levels mounted. The fame was intoxicating, but it masked something deeper. A young man thrust into a world of sharks, without the life experience to know who was swimming alongside him and who was circling to take a bite. After defeating Cervantes, Wilfred Benítez became a household name. And at an age when most teens are still learning who they are, he was already being treated like a king. But with the crown came a heavy burden. The boxing world is glamorous on the surface. Bright lights, screaming fans, million-dollar paydays. But behind that shine is a ruthless industry. One that doesn't give young fighters time to grow. Instead, it grinds them into dust if they slip up for even a second. Benítez didn't have time to mature. By age 20, he had already moved up in weight and taken on Carlos Palomino, a fighter known for his iron will and fierce body shots. The bout was brutal, a 15-round war that tested Benítez's stamina and nerve. When the dust settled, he was awarded a split decision win. It was another title, another historic moment, another banner headline. But as the glory grew louder, something else was beginning to fray. Less than a year later, in 1979, Wilfred stepped into the ring with Sugar Ray Leonard, one of the most celebrated American fighters of all time. The event was broadcast everywhere. Caesar's Palace was electric. Benítez had just secured the largest payday for a non-heavyweight at that time, $1.2 million. He was only 21 won, but this wasn't just a big fight, it was a wake-up call. Leonard dropped him early in the fight, and although Wilfred showed heart and slick defense, he was eventually stopped in the final seconds of the 15th round. It was the kind of defeat that doesn't ruin a career, but it plants a seed of doubt. Even Benítez's own father warned the world before that fight his son wasn't training like he used to. The discipline that once defined him was being eroded by the distractions of fame. And boxing doesn't wait for anyone. The moment you lose your edge, you're on the menu. But Wilfred still pressed forward. In 1981, he added yet another title by knocking out Morris Hope in spectacular fashion, becoming the youngest three-division champion in history. Then came Roberto Durán, hands of stone, a living nightmare for technical fighters. But Benítez was no ordinary technician. For 15 rounds, he outclassed Durán. It was a masterclass in defensive boxing. But what fans didn't see was the wear building up behind the scenes, the punishing training, the physical pain, the mental fog. With each victory, his body absorbed damage that no amount of technique could avoid. When he finally faced Thomas Hearns in 1982, it was a chess match from hell. Hearns was longer, meaner, and had dynamite in both fists. Benítez gave it everything he had, but it wasn't enough. He lost a majority decision, and that fight, that's when everything began to change. The downward slope was starting, and it would be steep, fast, and unforgiving. In the wake of his fight with Hearns, Wilfred Benítez was still considered elite, but something had shifted. He was slower to react, less sharp. His once legendary defense seemed just a bit behind. The reflexes that saved him from punishment in the past, they were beginning to fade. And in boxing, when your instincts slow, everything else crumbles with it. The media still praised him, but insiders were whispering. His lifestyle was becoming erratic. Training became optional. His focus wavered. His father, once his strictest guide, was losing control over the direction of Wilfred's career. And unfortunately, so was Wilfred. He began trusting the wrong people, promoters, managers, and hangers-on who saw his name as a ticket to profit. He wasn't reading contracts. He wasn't planning for the future. He was living like the millions would last forever, but they never do. In 1986, he traveled to Argentina for a relatively low-profile fight against Carlos Herrera. The result? A 7th-round TKO loss. But the defeat in the ring was only the beginning of the nightmare. When the final bell rang and Wilfred looked to collect his $25,000 purse, he discovered something chilling. His promoter had vanished, along with his passport, his documentation, his money, everything. Wilfred Benítez, once the golden boy of Puerto Rico, was now a stranded fighter in a foreign country with no way to get home. His wife reportedly told him not to return without the money. So, he stayed. What followed was one of the most humiliating chapters in boxing history. Benítez, a three-division world champion, was homeless on the streets of Argentina, begging, borrowing, and relying on the kindness of strangers just to survive. For over a year, he was trapped, abandoned by the industry that once cashed in on his brilliance. The promoter denied wrongdoing, but Wilfred had no lawyer, no union, no safety net. Boxing's dark underbelly was laid bare. This was a sport that threw him to the wolves, then left him to rot when they were done feeding. Eventually, through government intervention and word spreading to the right people, Benítez was brought back to Puerto Rico. But it was too late. The man who returned was not the same prodigy who had once danced around legends. He was broken, broke, and already showing the early signs of cognitive decline. His hands trembled, his speech slurred, but worst of all, he still didn't know it was over. And this, tragically, was only the beginning of a much darker final chapter. When Wilfred Benítez returned to Puerto Rico in 1987, after his harrowing year stranded in Argentina, many expected a redemption arc, a comeback story, a final fight, perhaps one last victory before riding off into the sunset. But what fans didn't realize, and what the sport didn't want to admit, was that the damage had already been done. The reflexes that once made him untouchable were now delayed. His movement, once fluid and impossible to read, had turned stiff and hesitant. More disturbing than any physical decline, though, was the look in his eyes. He was fading. He tried to keep going. A few more fights. One last attempt at reclaiming glory. But the world had moved on. By 1990, he officially retired from boxing at just 32 years old. A man who had accomplished more than most fighters do in a lifetime had burned out before reaching what should have been his peak. But the retirement retirement wasn't a peaceful one. His health was already deteriorating rapidly. He began forgetting things. He struggled with speech. He started walking into walls. At first, his mother and sister thought it was fatigue, but by the mid-90s, it was clear. Wilfred was suffering from severe brain damage. Doctors confirmed the worst. Wilfred had developed chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, the same condition plaguing retired NFL players and countless boxers. CTE isn't something that strikes all at once. It eats away at the mind over time. First memory goes, then motor control, then speech, then the ability to even recognize loved ones. For Wilfred, it was a slow descent into silence. A boxing genius who once operated with superhuman mental reflexes was now trapped inside a brain that no longer worked. And yet, there were no tributes, no outpouring of support from the boxing community. He was not treated like the legend he was. Instead, he was discarded. While other greats were given commentary jobs, endorsements, or speaking engagements, Wilfred was left sitting in a room, deteriorating in obscurity. The only ones who stayed were his family, and of them, no one stayed more loyal than his sister Yvonne. In the absence of fans, fighters, and promoters, one woman stepped up. Wilfred's sister Yvonne became his caretaker, guardian, and ultimately his lifeline. When most of the world had forgotten Wilfred Benítez existed, she fed him, she dressed him, she stretched his muscles every morning to prevent complete atrophy. She administered his medication and cleaned him after every accident. She sacrificed her life so that her brother could live with dignity. She wasn't trained in medicine. She had no nursing background. But what she lacked in formal education, she made up for with love and raw determination. "I do it because I love him," she told reporters. "Even if he doesn't remember who I am anymore, I know who he is. He's my brother. He's Wilfred." And that name still meant something to her, even if the world had stopped caring. By the late 2000s, Wilfred could no longer speak. His once powerful frame was reduced to skin and bones. His eyes, though open, were vacant. He couldn't walk. He couldn't feed himself. His hands shook uncontrollably, and his mind was barely present. He would sometimes cry out or become agitated with no warning. Emotional outbursts common in advanced cases of brain trauma. Through it all, Yvonne never left his side. They lived in a modest home in Puerto Rico. No nurses, no assistants, no financial support from the boxing organizations that had once celebrated him. The World Boxing Council eventually began sending him $200 a month. That's right, $200, for a man who brought in millions to the sport. It was a gesture, but a hollow one. Yvonne has begged the world not just for money, but for memory. "Don't let them forget him," she said. "He was great. He was the best." And she's right. Wilfred Benítez was once the radar. Now, he is a shadow. And the only thing preventing that shadow from disappearing completely is her. As if the decline of his health wasn't devastating enough, in 2017, Puerto Rico was hit by one of the worst natural disasters in its history, Hurricane Maria. The storm devastated the island. It destroyed homes, wiped out infrastructure, and left millions without power, clean water, or medical care. And for the Benítez household, it was catastrophic. Wilfred, already completely dependent on round-the-clock care, now had no electricity for medical equipment. His medications became harder to find. The water used for cleaning and feeding him was contaminated. Communication was impossible. For days, Yvonne had no idea if help was even coming. She rationed everything: food, medicine, even hope. News of their struggle eventually reached boxing fans in the mainland United States. A GoFundMe was started. Former heavyweight contender Fres Oquendo stepped in to help. And finally, with great difficulty, arrangements were made to relocate Wilfred and Yvonne to Chicago, where he could receive better care and be closer to Puerto Rican communities who remembered his greatness. But even this move was bittersweet. Yes, it provided some relief. Yes, it gave Yvonne help and a slightly better environment. But it also cemented a brutal truth. Wilfred Benítez, once revered in the boxing world, had become a refugee of both natural disaster and systemic neglect. neglect. His homeland could no longer care for him. His sport no longer spoke his name. And though his physical body remained, his identity, his voice, his pride, his presence was gone. What Hurricane Maria didn't wash away, CTE had already taken. And while some boxing commissions now discuss better post-career care for fighters, none have retroactively stepped in to give Wilfred the support he deserves. To many, he is just a sad story from another era, a cautionary tale. But to Yvonne, and to those who still remember what he once did in the ring, he is something more. He is a legend who was abandoned by the very world he helped build. Wilfred Benítez didn't just win titles, he made history. But as the years dragged on and his health continued to erode, something deeply unsettling happened. He was forgotten. In boxing halls of fame, his name was mentioned sparingly. His highlights became grainy YouTube clips with low view counts. Commentators praised the usual suspects: Ali, Sugar Ray, Tyson. But Benítez? He was a footnote, a whisper in a sport that owes him so much more. He was the youngest world champion in boxing history, 17 years old. Let that sink in. While most kids were still trying to pass their driver's test, Wilfred was defending a title against full-grown men. He was a prodigy, born to box, trained by a father who knew how to mold brilliance, and raised in a household where gloves came before homework. But the sport that made him a star also consumed him, left him with a battered mind and a forgotten legacy. When documentaries were made about boxing's greatest eras, Wilfred's image barely flashed across the screen. When networks celebrated anniversaries of classic bouts, his name was passed over. And while his contemporaries sat ringside as analysts or honored guests, Wilfred sat in silence, confined to a wheelchair, unable to communicate, in a modest room with blank walls and a television that barely played anything other than static. The sport turned its back. The fans moved on. The promoters who once praised his quickness and fearless style were nowhere to be found. They built entire franchises off fighters he once schooled in the ring, and yet he received no royalties, no acknowledgement, not even an occasional call. His sister Yvonne once said, "When they needed him to bleed, he bled. When they needed a warrior, he gave them wars. Now, he just needs help to breathe." It's a chilling truth. The boxing world didn't just forget Wilfred Benítez. It erased him. By the 2000s, Wilfred was no longer the man people remembered. He wasn't even the man he used to be in the early 2000s, when he could still speak a few words or smile faintly at familiar voices. Those final years brought nothing but stillness. There were days where his eyes would flicker open but show no recognition. There were moments where his lips moved as if to say something, maybe an echo of the past, but no sound followed. Yvonne would play him old footage from his fights. He didn't react. She showed him pictures of family members. He didn't blink. His muscles, once sharp and explosive, had withered. His hands trembled when lifted. His feet curled from years of disuse. Every part of him that once defied physics and logic now sagged under the weight of neurological decay. Even his breath became a struggle. Each inhale took effort. Each exhale sounded like goodbye. And as she sat beside him, brushing his thinning hair and speaking softly into his ear, Yvonne still believed he could feel something. "He's still in there," she told reporters. "He just can't come out." Doctors disagreed. The scans were conclusive. His brain had shrunk dramatically. Massive portions of his frontal lobe were no longer functioning. They warned that even basic recognition was likely gone. But Yvonne refused to accept it. Because Wilfred had fought back before. He'd done the impossible. He'd survived poverty, prejudice, and pummeling fists. Maybe, just maybe, he could survive this too. But CTE is not a broken rib. It's not a cut above the eye. It doesn't heal. It only rots. And Wilfred's once electrifying radar was now lost to static. The silence wasn't just in his voice. It was in the absence of remembrance. A champion without a crowd. A fighter without a corner. On November 12, 2023, the final bell rang. Wilfred Benítez died at the age of 65. The news didn't make headlines on every major outlet. There was no moment of silence on pay-per-view broadcasts. There was no tribute montage narrated by famous voices. Instead, there was a brief statement, a few tweets, and then more silence. For most, it was just another news scroll. For those who remembered, it was a heartbreak. And for Yvonne, it was the end of a 40-year battle. A battle to keep her brother alive, and more importantly, remembered. She held his hand until it went cold. She whispered to him that he was the greatest, that he was loved, that he was not alone. His funeral was modest. A few flowers, a few friends, no promoters, no network executives, no corporate sponsors, just family, just the people who stayed. There were no belts on display, no championship rings, just a photo of Wilfred in his prime. Gloves raised, face youthful, eyes sharp, mind unbroken. In the days that followed, tributes began to pour in, not from organizations, but from fans. Old fight clips were shared. Stories were retold. "He was the best defensive fighter I ever saw," one fan wrote. "Better than Mayweather, better than anyone." Others remembered watching his fights with their fathers, remembered the way he moved, how he could duck 6 punches in a row and never blink. It was a grassroots remembrance, a final surge of love for a man who had been forgotten too long. But even that couldn't erase the pain of how he was treated. Wilfred Benítez didn't die surrounded by glory. He died in silence, after decades of suffering, abandoned by the sport he helped elevate. And yet, in the silence, there is one last echo, a reminder that greatness can be fragile, that legends aren't bulletproof, and that sometimes the best thing a fighter can leave behind isn't a belt or a highlight reel, but a story, a warning, a legacy that asks us to remember and never let it happen again.